My name is Aiden Boisvert. I'm the Justice All Development Editor. I'm currently a Rising 3L, and I would just like to take a moment to thank everyone for coming here today. And I would also like to welcome Panel 2, discussing the effects of trauma on juvenile clients. This panel will cover sensitive topics, so please feel free to step out at any point if the discussion becomes difficult to listen to. I will now turn it over to our very own Professor Joseph. She is a professor of legal practice at Roger Williams University School of Law.
All right. Well, thank you. I think I have my mic on. Yes, it's on. All right. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for our wonderful panelists. I will let you guys briefly introduce yourselves. We'll start with Miyah, and then we'll get into the questions. Is that okay?
Yeah, sounds
All
good.
right.
My name is Miyah Grant. I am a staff forensic psychologist at the Mental Health Clinic, which is embedded in the Rhode Island Family Court, as well as an assistant clinical professor at Brown University in the Department of Psychiatry and Human.
Good morning or afternoon? Good morning still. Okay, I couldn't think of the time. Good morning. My name is Larome Myrick. I serve as the director of our Division of Juvenile Justice for the state of Rhode Island Department of Children, Youth, and Family, where I oversee the training school, which is the Adjudicated Detained Center for Young Men and Women, as well as the Office of Juvenile Probation.
Good afternoon. My name is Meg Fitzgerald. I'm a certified child life specialist at hospital. I've worked in the Aubin Center for the past 15 years, and I'm now the program manager for advocacy and prevention there. Thank you for having me.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Mike Gregory. I'm a clinical professor of law at Harvard Law School and have the privilege of directing our youth advocacy and policy lab, which also includes our education law clinic. Thank you for having me.
All right. Thank you. So let's start with Ms. Grant. In your role at the Rhode Island Family Court Mental Health Clinic, how do you integrate trauma-informed practices when you're working with court-involved youth?
Yeah, so just thinking across the board, studies have shown, that youth who come into contact with the juvenile legal system, 75 to about 93% of them have experienced some sort of traumatic event in their lifetime. So we're talking a large amount of the population for youth involved in the juvenile legal system. So it's a pretty big task to implement trauma-informed practices throughout an entire court-wide system. However, Rhode Island is putting forth a lot of effort. First, just with having a mental health clinic embedded in the Rhode Island Family Court that allows for easy access for consultation, clinical case consultation during hearings with the attorneys, with clinicians who are trained in trauma-informed care. So that's kind of like, I'd say, one of the really unique things about our family court here in Rhode Island is having that access to the mental health clinic. In addition to that, it all kind of starts with change of the court environment and making it more trauma informed. And so we do a lot of education and training with court personnel to understand and be able to recognize and reconceptualize youth behaviors from a trauma-informed lens. So a lot of training and a lot of education and providing clinical consultation through trauma-informed approaches. And then another big piece in terms of integrating trauma-informed care in the court is related to trauma screening. So unique to our court, every youth that comes through our diversionary program is screened for traumatic events or for mental health symptoms. That's very important because we're already identifying the mental health needs of youth just as they're entering or having their first contact with the system. So we're trying to divert them, and we're also identifying their mental health needs and connecting them to services, so trauma-informed treatments in the community. In addition to that, through our mental health clinic, we use more developmentally appropriate tools to do further assessments so that we can provide like resiliency-based recommendations for youth who have traumatic experiences. And we're really looking at the environments in which they live in, their say the court is putting forth a lot of efforts in doing so.
Well, that was a really heartbreaking statistic that you gave us about the percentage of um, young people who come into the system already bearing this trauma. So I'll ask the panel. We talked in the last session about how trauma manifests itself in adults. How have you guys observed how trauma impacts a child's behavior, not only inside the courtroom, but in your interaction with them or in their interaction with the system?
I'll touch a little bit. We have to realize 100% of the kids who enter our systems have experienced trauma. So that's a real important number to realize. And so what are we doing to address that trauma? So we have to look at the people who are working with the kids. Because guess what? They come from the same community the kids coming from. And they also have trauma. So you need to realize that the staff have trauma and the youth have trauma. And so you don't, and we all heard the adage, hurt people hurt people. So that's why it's important to make sure that when we're working with our staff, that we address their traumas and you know, not that we're being their therapists, but they understand they're going through stuff. So that they, and the second piece of that is making sure they understand the youth who we serve. I always say the one piece of trauma that a kid has when they come through our systems is just being involved, being impacted by the criminal justice system. It's traumatic in and of itself. You know, getting handcuffs placed on you, walking into a court, not to mention the other traumas that precedes that could have preceded that. Sometimes it's family, things happen to the family, in the community, or in the schools. So just that 100% of realization that the folks have trauma.
So my work centers on schools, and our project, the Trauma and Learning Policy Initiative, has been around since 2004, and our focus has been on helping educators understand the impacts and consequences of trauma. And so your question is about behavior. One of the things that it's been our task over the past 2 decades to do is to help educators understand that there's not one way that trauma shows up in students' behavior in the classroom. It can show up in a whole spectrum of ways. And so often the kids who are on everybody's radar screen are those who are engaging in externalizing behaviors, who are trying to assert some sense of agency over their environment by acting out in observable ways, and sometimes in ways that violate rules of the school or that appear on the surface to be antisocial. But it would be a mistake to think that those are the only students who might be exhibiting traumatic behaviors. Sometimes trauma can manifest in internalizing behaviors. The students who are withdrawing from the school community or dissociating or staring out the window or not on anybody's radar screen, in fact, flying very much under the radar screen, that can also be a sign that something isn't quite right. And also, this is one that I can really identify with, the perfectionists, those who are trying to assert their agency by doing everything just right and making sure that we please the adults and please everyone around us. So behavior related to trauma can show up in a whole spectrum of ways in the school setting.
And can I add,
Yes, please.
just in the, in the court and working with juveniles who are court involved, the way in which their behavior is interpreted is a really big piece of incorporating trauma-informed approaches. So what we want to do is not misinterpret behaviors such as kind of like sitting back, being quiet, just nodding, just being in agreement, or just not engaging at all. We will see that these youth who are already experiencing traumatic events throughout their lifetime coming into the system often will be labeled as oppositional, as defiant, not engaged, but we have to really consider developmentally these youth are not able to entirely cope with what's going on, and in this new situation where they may already be mistrustful of authority figures, they might not engage so quickly. So I think that's something just to keep in mind is when you're thinking about trauma-informed approaches, we really need to be thinking about how do we ensure that we're not misinterpreting a youth's behavior, because that can significantly impact the services that we connect them to and just the trajectory of their legal proceedings.
And
Can I
that's,
just add, sorry,
yes,
can I add
yes,
to that?
please.
That really spoke to me because my role at the Aubin Center, I'm a child life specialist. So
Yes.
therapeutic play to help children cope with hospitalization, but specifically in my role in the Aubin Center to help them cope with the evaluation for child maltreatment. And so we see a lot of children who are being evaluated for child sexual abuse or child molestation. And, you know, I think what you said about not interpreting their behaviors is really relevant because my job is to play. And there's other facets of my job, but when children arrive to our clinic, the first thing that I'm focused on, is my mic working? Okay. The first thing that I'm focused on is allowing them to be a child. And what all children do is navigate the world through play. It's their language, it's what they do best, and it's how they figure out their development, it's how they figure out their social interactions, it's how they figure out conflict. And so when children come to our clinic and, you know, it could potentially be to talk about perhaps the worst experience or experiences of their life, they often play their way through the evaluation. And so if someone who doesn't understand that that is the role or the work of the child, they may interpret that as they are not traumatized. And it's important that we don't look at each individual behavior that a child is exhibiting to kind of categorize their trauma. Because oftentimes in the Aubin Center, children play from the moment they arrive until the moment they leave, including during their forensic exam. So I really appreciate you saying that, Miyah.
And I also appreciate that because I think that at times as legal professionals, we forget that we are dealing with children and that they do need the space to be children. And so, in addition to what we just kind of talked about, what kind of strategies can we as legal professionals use in order to accommodate these effects by the children? And we kind of touched on some of them, but it was a great segue. So if you guys have any further thoughts into what strategies we can use to when these children exhibit these affects.
Um, in some of our trainings with court personnel, what we have prioritized is really the rapport and providing, you know, a safe and a safe environment that's both emotionally and physically safe for the youth. Um, it's difficult. I can understand as a legal professional, your time is very limited in how much you're able to engage with a youth. And so you're like, I need you to kind of like get on board with this. But at the same time, having rapport with the youth is going to make the job so much easier. And I think having appropriate conversations that are having conversations that are developmentally appropriate. So recognizing that a 14, 15, 16-year-old is not going to have the same language as you. They're not going to understand the legal terms that you may be using. So you might have to spend a bit more time really discussing what the process looks like, really identifying and defining the different terms that you're using and walking them through what the next steps will be to allow them to feel a bit more comfortable to engage and have a better understanding of what their role is in the legal process. So I think a lot of collaboration with the youth is important.
I would also add that today is November 15th, 2024. I pray and hope that we keep this same momentum November 15th, 2025, November 15th, 2026, November 15th, 2027, and November 15th, 2028. Thank you. We all know what just happened, and this is not a political talk, but we can look at since the murder of George Floyd, and I believe it was 2020. There was a big increase. Like we got to do something. We got to do something, and people started doing something. And then you go to 2022 and 2023, and now the something's 80% of that something is done. Fortunately, we're in the state, and we're around a big group of people here that really wants to continue this, keep this momentum. But it has to extend beyond this room. It has to extend beyond this conference, and we can't back down until every disparity is erased. You know, if and I know it sounds cliche, but if there's one, there's way too many. And it's easy to say especially as lawyers, you can say like that's somebody else's job. You know, I've been working in corrections 25 years, and the first thing we used to always say, we talked about it was called DMC back then, disproportionate minority contact. We would say we don't control who comes to us. That was the easy thing to say, like, But guess what? The people come to us look like me, so I'm in the seat, so I have to do something. And you have to remember you're in the seat, so you have to do something. So some of the something that I believe to go to your question. Sorry, I take a long way to
No,
get there.
please.
Uh, but some of the things I think you ought to legal professionals can and should and must do is stay educated on cultural linguistic competence of the youth and the families and community that you're serving. Um, understand the unique needs that people have, because a lot of times we want to put our views on somebody else, and we have to understand that the families, the youth, the community are subject matter experts of their life and their situation,
Hmm.
and they're inviting us into a place. Now we may have the degrees and the robes and whatever the case may be, but we're working with real people, so we have to be real intentional about understanding ongoing trainings and professional development. Seminars like this, I really hope that these things really continue and that they continue to grow and grow beyond just inside this room, but bigger rooms and across the country. I promise. Two more points and I'll be quiet. Um, um, we need to talk to the clients and to their families. You know, remember, because these are still people. Talk to them like, what's going to help you? What can we do? And sometimes it's okay to just sit back and just shut up, and they're right. We don't have to agree with everything. And my last piece is just be open. Be open. Be honest with me. I don't understand what you're going through. Help me understand it. Even if I don't understand, I'm still going to support you through this. So that's a piece I want to just add on.
Thank you. So my next question, and kind of going along that same line, is from Michael. In your co-authored report, Helping Traumatized Children Learn, what are the key recommendations for schools, and how can legal professionals advocate for their implementation at a policy level?
Thanks for that question. Um, I guess I want to start just by explaining a little bit more about the work that I do and
Yeah.
uh, my answer to your question. So one of our projects at the Youth Advocacy and Policy Lab is called the Trauma and Learning Policy Initiative, and it's an interdisciplinary project. I think that's actually really important. Um, what I'm about to share couldn't possibly have been realized or learned by lawyers alone. We have a team that includes former educators, former school psychologists, and school social workers. And we work in a three-pronged way to achieve the mission that all students, including those who have endured traumatic experience, will succeed in school. And so we like to think of it as the three-legged stool. The first leg of the stool is the work that I and my law students and lawyer colleagues do, which is representing individual students and families in the special education and school discipline system. The second leg of the stool is that the former educators and mental health professionals on our team partner directly with schools and districts, primarily in Massachusetts, but also sometimes in other places, who come to us and are seeking help in figuring out how to create learning environments in their schools that are sensitive to the needs of students who have experienced trauma. And the third leg of the stool is that all of us work together in an interdisciplinary way to channel everything that we're learning from our individual clients and from our education partners into the policy arena and to advocate for laws and policies that will support schools to create the kind of learning environments that all students need. So you referenced our publication, Helping Traumatized Children Learn, which is actually a publication that has several volumes. And the first volume was published in 2005. Volume 2 was published in 2013. And Volume 3 is forthcoming. I don't know when, but it will appear.
We'll be waiting. We'll be waiting.
And sort of as Professor Katz referred to earlier, we look back on the 2005 publication and see only all the things that we didn't know now that we wish we had known then, and see all of its flaws. But your question was about what are the recommendations for schools, and maybe I can succinctly try to summarize the trajectory of our thinking on that over the course of these years of these publications. The volume 1 really focused on the idea of first just helping educators understand what trauma is and how it shows up for young people in school. And the recommendations focused on the need to have the response be a whole school response. It was important to us to try to resist the notion that the way we address trauma in school is simply by including more special ed services or hiring more mental health counselors. Those things might be very important, but unless the whole school has an understanding of trauma, those individual interventions are likely to be insufficient. And so we developed something called the flexible framework, which is an outline of school operations. And the idea was once you look through the trauma lens, you have to change all of your practices in the school. And so there were 6 components of this flexible framework. The first is leadership. The second is professional development. The third is access to resources and services. The fourth is classroom practice, teaching and learning, what happens in the classroom. The fifth is looking at all the policies and procedures of the school and thinking about them in a trauma-sensitive way. And the sixth is engaging deeply with families and communities. Well, fast forward to 2013, what we learned in those intervening years was that it's very difficult to just change all the practices of the school if there's not also a corresponding change in the culture of the school. That really trauma sensitivity means creating a community, creating an environment in which everybody feels a sense of trust, a sense of safety, a sense of connection, and that you can't just go right to the practices if you haven't worked on what people's beliefs and value system is. And so the focus of the second volume was this process that we called the inquiry-based process, which is a way in which educators in a school can come together and prioritize creating a trauma-sensitive learning environment and all share ownership and decision-making over how to go about doing that in a particular school. What we're focused on for the forthcoming volume really is a growing understanding about the role of power, which is a word that came up a little bit in the first panel. That at the end of the day, trauma really is about power. The experience of being traumatized in any number of ways is the experience of having your power taken away from you in a very threatening, consequential, and harmful way. And what we've come to realize is that we can't even talk about creating trauma-sensitive schools if we're not really being attentive to the power dynamic that exists inside a school. Because if all we're doing is changing our practices or offering a few interventions, but sending young people into a system where power is oriented in a certain way, in which they really have very little power, we're probably sending them into a system that's going to re-traumatize them. And so for us, trauma sensitivity has become a process of focusing on, in a really deliberate way, what the power dynamics are in an institution, thinking about who gets to participate, who has a voice and under what circumstances. And for us, that has really become a focus on making sure that parents and students, as well as educators, have a real say in the decision-making that happens in a school, both on the things that impact them individually, but also on the culture and the community of the school as a whole.
Thank you. I think that's so important, especially when you talk about the interdisciplinary aspect of helping children who have dealt with traumatic situations. So my next question is for Meg. Speaking of the importance of this interdisciplinary work, can you talk to us more about how the therapeutic play aids in the emotional healing of children undergoing evaluations at the Aubin Center, and perhaps how these techniques might be utilized in a legal setting?
Sure, yeah. You know, as you said, the interdisciplinary approach, I'm looking around in the room and, you know, there's all these future attorneys, and then over here there's like my Hasbro, Rhode Island agent's office people. And I have an appreciation for the collaboration every single day. And even the training school, you know, we've never met, but I have some overlap in the work that I do there. I have a real appreciation for interdisciplinary approach or multidisciplinary approach. And, you know, Dr. Duffy and Lori and the other members of the SAFE team are here, and Taylor Matuk from the AG's office and Dr. Goldberg. And these, you know, 4 different groups are, we don't work out of the same office, but yet we overlap with our patients or our victims every single day. and their seamless communication. And I know I'm supposed to talk about play, but I just had I just had to acknowledge that, you know, I think we are so successful in the work that we do for child victims and their families because we communicate and because we work with an interdisciplinary approach. And again, for me, that starts with play. And I can say it until I'm blue in the face that play is the work of a child. And so from the moment they come in, when I offer them an opportunity to play, not only am I hopefully diffusing some of their stress, but I'm also showing them that I'm going to their level. And that's not down, that's me rising up to theirs, right? They navigate the world through playful interactions. And when we take the time to, you know, like Miyah had said, build rapport and connect with kids. And for me, that's through play. And I will encourage you to keep that in the back of your mind that there's an opportunity in every single setting to play with a child. It doesn't need to be a full-blown game of Monopoly. I hate Monopoly. I don't have it in my toy. Worst game ever. No, it's terrible, Larome. I work for Hasbro, and I shouldn't acknowledge it's a Hasbro game, but it's the worst. It takes too long, and I cheat just so it can end. But you can play anywhere, really, whether it's just a basket of fidgets in your office, you know, a deck of cards, virtual I Spy. Okay, we're looking around the room, and what you're really saying to the child is, I'm willing to speak your language. I'm willing to take the time to come to your level. And when we do that, we learn about the child. We help them to diffuse the stress that they're feeling and really open up conversation. Developmentally, children are not meant to understand this process. Adults don't understand this process. If it was an easy process to understand, you all wouldn't go to school as long as you do. So it's developmentally inappropriate for young children to understand that after they experience a trauma, that they could tell about it. And to understand the aftermath of that. You know, you're going to have a medical exam, you're going to speak with a police officer, you know, you're going to then meet a prosecutor who's going to represent you. How do you even fathom that in the mind of a 6-year-old? And what I find and what research tells us is that when we incorporate play into as many interactions as possible while we're delivering this information, it allows children to process it. And so, you know, we have Friday meetings where we discuss our cases at the end of each week, and members from the Attorney General's office come, and I'm looking at Taylor because, you know, she's often across the table from us, and I'm saying, oh, this child was really, really nervous, but when I, you know, sat down and I played with them, they were able to say that they're most afraid that their mom's not going to be able to pay the bill if their stepfather who abused them leaves the home. And Taylor writes it down, right? And okay, well, what did you play with them? And it's just that communication that then allows her to go back when she meets her client and say, I heard you met Meg at the Aubin Center, and I heard that you did this and that. And it's showing children that the adults are listening, and encouraging them to participate in a process that they're not meant to participate in.
Thank you. My next question is for Larome. So, as executive director of the Rhode Island Training School, you've led initiatives that have reduced admissions, such as community-based alternatives. Can you tell us more about some of those strategies and why it's important to have alternatives to the system?
I can. I always start out with a few statistics. I'm not a math person, so I'm going to keep them real easy numbers. But the young people here, they're about 12% of our population. But it's important to remember they're 100% of our future. So they're the ones that's going to be filling these rooms up pretty soon. But also the kids who come to the training school, 100% of those kids leave and come back to a community. So it's important to realize, like, what are we doing with those kids? One thing Dr. Grant touched on it earlier was she talked about the family court diversion program, because our work is really intentional with the family courts and with the community, the importance of keeping kids outside of the training school who don't need to be there. So we're real intentional about diverting kids. But in addition to diversion, more importantly, is preventing kids from coming in there as well. So when we talk about community-based alternatives, we have to recognize that, one, that these are kids, these are youth. And if anybody know anything about kids, they're gonna do stuff. and they're gonna do stuff to annoy us. That's just what they're designed to do. Actually, I have my daughter right there, so yeah. um, but they're gonna do stuff, and that stuff needs to be addressed. You know,
You're
it's
not
so
talking to her directly now.
not her, not her. No, she's great. She's great.
Sure.
I'm talking to her sisters.
Okay.
No, no. But they're gonna do stuff that needs to be addressed in the community. And what are we gonna do? We can do something, or we can do nothing. And actually, and part of that something is incarceration really the best. Um, for most people, no, it's not. Um, we also need to understand normative adolescent behavior because, again, kids are going to do kid stuff. Adults are going to do adult stuff. I'm almost 45 years old, and I was with three of my best friends in Atlanta about a month ago, and I promised I was the youngest one, and I promise you we acted younger than my daughter over there. So to judge a kid based off something that they did without the brain function is shame on us and to hold them accountable. But when they do something, we have to do something. So what is that something that we do? One of the reasons why we've been so successful, we actually, in addition to the family court and stuff like that, we partner with communities um, because we partner with communities to support and to create just community alternative placements. You know, alternative placement for kids because we have to address the behavior. We understand it. Nobody's saying just let kids go run free. If we do that, then shame on us. But do we need to place them in the least restrictive part? So one of the things that we do, even our department at DCYF, we partner with the juvenile hearing boards. And one of the things, and the beauty of that is you still hold the kids accountable, but you give them services they need. And we prevent many kids from even going to a diversion program or worse to a formalized courtroom at all in the juvenile justice system. But the second piece is, because of course we can't touch every kid, but the last piece what we do is, you know, when the kids do come to the training school, because that's what's going to happen, day one, we prepare the youth to go home. So we're connected with the schools, we're connected with the community, we're connected with their families, we're connected with volunteers. So one of the things that we're doing, and we started pre-2020, and right before COVID time, we started a reentry process inside the training school. And what that is, we gave community passes for kids to go home. You know, initially it may start with you may get to go to McDonald's for 2 hours with your mother to go have McDonald's. Then eventually you spend a Christmas break at home for 2 weeks with your family. Well, if you get to spend if you're at home for 2 weeks, then guess what? You don't need to be with us anyway. So we try to get those kids introduced back to their communities as quick as possible.
I'm so glad that you brought up that we need to recognize some of these behaviors that are normal within children. I think that a lot of times, particularly when you're working in the court system, that we forget that some of these behaviors aren't intentionally criminal and that
Right.
they are, normal, not only normal child behavior, but part of their child development.
Right.
So, and I'll put this question to the panel. How do you think that that plays a role, if any, in trauma that a child experiences? The very fact that they step into an environment where they're being told that their normal childhood behavior, that there's something wrong with it, or that that we're essentially criminalizing their behavior. How does that impact trauma in
I want to go. I can talk for hours. But
youth?
one of the things that we fail to realize is, and we only do it with certain kids, usually black and brown, because we adultify them. You know, we'll see these kids and not realizing that they're kids, because especially black boys. There was I think it was a Yale study amongst teachers, and there was teachers. There were black teachers, there was white teachers, there was young teachers, there was old teachers, there was inexperienced teachers, and there were very experienced teachers. But what was done was said, look for misbehavior. Look for these four kids. There was four kids sitting in a room. One was a black boy, one was and some other kids. They said, look for misbehavior. And what they didn't know was it was eye tracking software. Everybody looked for the kid who looked like me. Because of cultural conditioning, we're taught to realize, like, if anybody in this room going to act up, it's going to be me. They're gonna look like me. And so my point of being that is understanding the bias that we all have. And this wasn't just white people thinking against the black folks. it was everybody. We all had that cultural conditioning.
Mm-hmm.
But just understanding that this is something real. We have to understand we can't adultify kids. We also can't take things personal with kids because sometimes people who work with kids, we forget that they're kids. One of the best things that ever happened to me with being a father was when I started working for the Department of Youth Services in Ohio, and we had to talk about transition age youth with kids. And one of my close friends was a psychologist, and he's an attorney, so he went through a lot of school. But he talked to us about, hey, understanding kids are going to do kid stuff, and I think that was the day that I became a better father, and understanding. So just understanding that part. I think I answered some of your questions. I know it's more, but
No, that's great.
Yeah, could I piggyback on that? We often take care of adolescents who engage in high-risk adolescent behavior or normal adolescent behavior, leaving home without permission or staying past curfew or consuming alcohol or substances while at a party that unfortunately plays a part in their trauma. And what I see sometimes happen afterwards is the type of questioning that then impacts their trauma even further. So when children have, left their home, drank alcohol, and after that, right, potentially not because of that, but after that, experienced a sexual assault, and now they have to speak with a uniformed police officer in the emergency department right before they're getting a forensic evidence kit, and the sequence of questions that sometimes could be asked while it's the role of a police officer to obtain the facts and get the information to understand, potential evidence. Some of these questions can be really damning to children who have experienced trauma. Like, well, why did you leave? What made you leave? What were you thinking when you left? And I really see that when children are faced with that in their initial disclosure, it can really then impact the rest of the process that a child experiences in the subsequent investigation. And I just wanted to mention that as well.
I think highlighting that childhood behavior is really important. It reminds me of when I was in practice. I remember representing. I don't remember how young the child was, but he was young enough that as he was waiting for his case to be called, he was in the hallway with his cousin, who was the co-defendant, and they were playing. They were running up and down the hallway in the courthouse. They were jumping on the bench, jumping on and off the bench, and just playing in the hallway after being dragged to court, I think, for stealing a bike or something like that. And so I remember going to the prosecutor and just saying to her, "Can I pull you aside for a second? I just want to show you something." And she's like, "Okay." And I just quietly like stepped to the door and I was like, "I just want you to see who you're prosecuting." And I just showed her these children as they're in the act of playing. And she was kind of like, "Wow, like, okay, I get it." So keeping that in mind, what role does cultural competency play in understanding and advocating for children who've experienced trauma? Anyone can take that question.
I think it plays just a huge role in terms of the cultural values of the family, of the youth, but then also extending into the community environment. If you're working with youth in a particular district or area of Providence or outside of Providence, understanding the factors, the social determinants of health that may be contributing to how they're behaving. With youth who are, presenting at the court, oftentimes we will be called because a youth might be really upset right after or right before a hearing. And then we go up there and just provide some context of like conceptualizing their behaviors and helping, whether it's legal professionals or the judge or CASA attorneys, just understanding like this is a very normative reaction for anyone, and especially for a youth who has a history of traumatic experiences, who does not trust authority, who is confused by this legal process. And working with families, I think a lot of the work you do with youth, you're doing a lot of work also with parents and families and navigating those dynamics in relationships. And so having a good understanding of the cultural values within that family unit is going to allow you to address the particular concerns with a youth in a way that may just be more comfortable for them. So having, let's say, families who don't believe in, mental health services or believe in engaging in mental health supports, that's something that's going to be really important to know because let's say you need to connect them with services. There are so many different kinds of services, so many different types of therapeutic interventions. And so you're going to want to have being able to identify the most culturally appropriate service to refer them to. So I think just having a good understanding of the culture within the family dynamics and then also within the community context.
An additional piece of this that that I think about and have had the blessing of learning about from educators and those with certain lived experience and professional experience is about the importance of recognizing that schools, again, which is my context, are places where, in addition to all the learning that they're doing, young people are forming their identities. They're figuring out who they are as a learner, who they are as a person, who they are as a citizen. Schools are designed to help young people prepare to be adults, to take their role in society. And so many of our young people go to schools where the messages they receive about who they are negative and worse than negative. Just really violently harmful. And so when we want to think about the context of trauma, we assert a sense of agency and power in the face of really negative things that may have happened to them in their life outside of school. That has to include re-empowering them to set their own agenda about what their identity is going to be. I also work in the special education context, so disability is often a factor that enters into this identity formation. Learning is hard for you. You are not going to be a good learner. You cannot succeed in school. It's really hard to counteract those messages, and it can only happen in the context where young people are part of relationships where they experience trust and safety. And so I guess that's just another piece of the puzzle for me, is recognizing that each of these young people we're working with is an identity that's in the process of being formed. And how do we help empower them to be in charge of who they're going to be and what their narrative is going to be in the world? I just think of all of the conversations I've been a part of, IEP meetings or others, even school discipline hearings, where the student is sitting there and all the adults are talking about them as if they aren't in the room. And how much more humiliating and disempowering can you get than that? A few thoughts.
Well, to add to that, Michael, what advice, since we're in a room full of law students and aspiring wonderful attorneys, what advice would you give to students who are looking to specialize in this area of law, be it educational law or maybe specifically focused on students with special needs, that sort of thing, and involving trauma-informed advocacy in their work?
I mean, I guess the first thing I would say is, please do. We need you. We need you. And if your experience of law school is like mine was, I mean, speaking about the messages you receive, I mean, the messages I received in law school was that this work is not valued. This is not high prestige lawyering work. This is the people who are the luminaries of our profession are not people who are sitting in IEP meetings or working in school, working with families. So let me counteract that message and say, for my money, this is the most important work you could be doing. I mean, picking up on your point, Larome, I mean, kids are 100% of our future. So if you care about, things like democracy and justice or, just housing or the economy or whatever it may be, we're not going to have any of those things if young people are not supported to grow up and play the role they need to play. And so we can lawyer in those spaces and help create systems and interventions that help young people get where they need to go. I think that's really important work. So I would encourage you. That would be the number one thing I would do.
I hope you all are listening. Meg, could you discuss the importance of effective coping strategies for children in traumatic situations and how these strategies can be supported or implemented by attorneys and legal advocates.
Okay. Is Will still here? Oh, yeah. Well, you
Yes.
stole my thunder because you already started speaking about that so eloquently. Just in the deep breathing techniques that you use for yourself and offering kids to take a walk, and it's that sort of thing. You get it. Well done. Just trying to encourage children to utilize whatever coping technique works for them. And something that we do in the Aubin Center, again, from the moment kids arrive, is really tell them what steps to expect. Kids like to know and they like to be in control. So even while I'm engaging in therapeutic play with them, the play is very child directed. I always let them decide, and sometimes they take control over in their play, and I allow that to unfold. But also let them know, this is what we're going to do today. First, we're going to do this, and this is why. Next, we're going to do this, and this is why. And after that, this. And each part of the way, you're in control. You're the boss here. If you have questions or you have concerns, then you can tell someone here, and really laying out to them that they have the agency and the autonomy in the process. And, as Gregory was saying, I think everyone has said today, is when children experience trauma or even adults experience trauma, it's a loss of power. It's a loss of control that they had. And for us in our setting, we really try to instill in children that they can have that power, at least in our setting. We can't promise them that they'll have it in every setting, because the sad reality is they won't. But when they can, they should. There's little ways. I'm not an attorney, and I don't necessarily go to court with children. My colleague does, but I help to prepare them for those next steps. But from a child development expert, I'm just thinking of some tools that can be utilized in your relationship as attorneys with kids, and something so little as allowing them the control of what you're going to wear the day they testify. What's your favorite color? What color shirt should I wear? So when you look at me and you're on the stand, you know that you're in control in this courtroom. It's something so minor, but it's a constant reminder, right? Children want to be seen, they want to be heard, and that's so small but so big to them. And they have, they're looking at you all day in the courtroom. And so when they see that pink shirt that they chose or that green shirt that they chose, they know that you see them, they know that you heard them, and they know that you're in their corner. So it's the little things. Go channel your 6-year-old self, if that was a good age for you, and just think about the things that you would have wanted done to you. And when you do that for and with a child, that is helping them cope.
I think additionally, just adding, the more that you can prepare a child or an adolescent for the process, the better. So even just identifying the different roles of the people in the courtroom. I know when I first started working at the court, I'd go in there and I'm like, why are there so many people in here? And I don't really understand every single person's role. For children and adolescents, they're just as and even more confused. And so we're putting them in situations where they're unfamiliar with most, and they're put in a position in which they might have to talk about something difficult. People are asking them questions or talking about their experiences in front of them. So identifying like, hey, so you're going to see this person. They're going to be in a robe. That's the judge. The judge does X, Y, Z. And utilizing developmentally appropriate language for the youth. So if it's a younger child, you're going to get to their developmental level and explain kind of what the role of the judge is. And if it's a teenager, you'll kind of do something different, but making sure that they're well prepared to step into that courtroom. So even if you have an opportunity, let's say like in the family court, there tends to be on the 5th floor, like a couple empty courtrooms throughout the day, like taking a step in there with the child and saying like, when we come in, we're going to go this way. We're going to stand behind this desk. When the judge talks to us, we're going to say your honor. So helping them understand what the process is going to look like so that they are not shocked in a state of like heightened anxiety throughout, because that's when we're going to see them shut down. That's when the mistrust is going to come, and that will just make the whole process more difficult.
Can I add to that?
Absolutely.
Okay. So when I'm working with child life interns or even residents or nurses who rotate through the Aubin Center, part of my role is to prepare children for forensic exams. So explaining to them the utility in having a genital examination done. And it's, I often have people ask, like, well, what if I say the wrong thing? What if I miss something when preparing a child? And I love that you mentioned that, explaining the role of each person. A tip that child life specialists use that I'll impart to you is when you prepare a child for anything through their senses, you're generally not going to miss anything. So think about what they're going to see, think about what they might feel, what they might hear. And when you tap into each one of their senses, you're helping to reorient them to the space. And what we know is that children who are about to testify, right, or speak about their trauma, they might be in fight or flight. Their nervous system is activated. And so it's a grounding technique to also tap into the senses, and you generally won't miss anything.
And incorporating a trauma-informed approach just means being able to identify the cues that a youth might be in distress or approaching like an outburst and being emotionally dysregulated. Ask for a break. Kind of just make sure that you're observing, the youth's behavior. You've built rapport, and you kind of understand you understand what trauma reactions look like, and can advocate in the room in real time for a break, so that the youth can, take a step and utilize a comfort tool, or get a hug from a family member, or just take a step outside of the courtroom and do some like deep breathing. But I think a big piece of being trauma informed and utilizing trauma informed approaches is recognizing what that distress might look like in a child.
Absolutely. Larome, I want to ask you, I think it's pretty well known the racial inequities that exist within the juvenile, well, in the criminal justice system, let alone the juvenile justice system. Can you talk a little bit about what you've seen in terms of these racial disparities and what best practices that lawyers can implement when representing juveniles to account for those disparities?
I'll talk about, well, let me start with this. Unfortunately, the disparities are just not unique to Rhode Island.
Yes.
The other 49 of our neighbors have them, and have them just as worse, if not worse, and they're doing nothing about it. Unfortunately, we're in a position here where we are, I always say, ahead of the curve. Still got a whole lot to go, but because the thing we are at least talking about them. But we have work groups to address this. Myself and Dr. Grant and a few of us sit on different committees where we talk about this. I think it's every other month where we actually put the information out there and share, like, hey, this is the population of kids in the juvenile justice system. This is their race. This is their gender. This is the neighborhood they come from. Because we talk about disparities, race is the biggest one, so let's not get there. I'm for race aside for just a quick second. I want to call attention to other ones too, because some of the things that we see of the disparities, the number of women who become incarcerated. I did my dissertation. It was over women incarcerated, and through my lit review, I learned that while the number of men tended to plateau or even go down for incarceration, women rates were growing exponentially, and that's something that we also need to talk about. I know that's not this conference, but just something to talk about, to think about. Socioeconomic status is one. Another one, where you come from, your zip code, then first generation. Then the biggest one is race. But race also encapsulates all the other four I talked about as well. So women of color, poorer women, first generation women, women from inner cities. So we need to really, really be cognizant of that. One of the things we have to do is keep talking about it. I talked about we have several work groups to address it. But also the lawyers must also understand that the needs, I mean, we talked about it earlier, so I'm not going to delve into it real deep, but understand the needs of your clients and the people that we're serving. Understand that when a family is in need, you may be just a lawyer, but you're more than just a lawyer. There's sometimes, especially for young people, you're that parent. Sometimes you're that teacher. Sometimes you're that Uber. Sometimes you're whatever that kid needs to get the services that they need. So sometimes you see some people just stay in their lane. Well, oh, I'm not this. You need to call a social worker for that. Well, Esquire, you're that social worker right now. You have to place that. So it's important to be cognizant of that. And the last piece is just use your colleagues, because you're not going to know everything. You're not going to be super comfortable with everything. Nobody is. And if you are, you're you're telling an alternative fact. um, but use your colleagues as a resource. You know, like, hey, I have this kid who does X, Y, and Z. I have this family who does. Nobody's gonna think less of you. They're gonna think more important. Like, wow, this person reached out to me. So please use each other. Use your networks.
And maybe the rest of the panelists can touch on, in your specific disciplines and in the work that you do, what are some of the mental health consequences maybe that you've observed in general that stem from some of these racial inequalities within the system that you work in?
So, just the research shows that youth who come into contact with the juvenile legal system experience much higher rates of depression, anxiety, and are at a higher risk for developing PTSD and having traumatic stress symptoms. So, that's just what we know. And we already know that upwards 90+% of youth coming into the juvenile legal system already have a history of traumatic exposure. And so, for youth from marginalized communities and identities, we're thinking about chronic stress and chronic complications to their mental health and well being. They're coming into contact with the legal system at a time where they may already have significant mental health symptoms that are underlying, and this might bring it out. This might kind of trigger, activate those sort of reactions and traumatic reactions. Let me see here. Also, I think just talking about the ways in which our system, our institutionalization of youth is traumatic in itself. Even when we have youth coming into contact with diversion, and diversion is like our best effort at steering them away from never having to go formal, never having to go in front of a judge, they're still coming into the courthouse. They're still being read their rights. It's still a very difficult process for them. And so just thinking that these youth have chronic mental health concerns kind of being built more and more the further that they go into the legal system. And so we definitely want to steer them away from that.
Anybody else want to chime in?
I mean, I guess what the response that I'm thinking of sort of stems from your question, but sort of goes maybe in a little bit of a different direction, which is, I mean, the question is about what mental health consequences do we observe? I mean, I guess it just seems important to me to name like the real mental health crisis that we see in schools right now, at least in my state of Massachusetts. And I suppose it was there before COVID, but man, COVID sure like brought it out. And part of how I've come to understand what's going on in schools, where kids' behavior is just more dysregulated than ever, and there are more position openings and staff turnover than ever, and workforce shortages, and schools are just really on the front lines of still continuing to deal with the collective trauma that we all went through. Part of the way that I've come to understand that is that in addition to just the trauma of the pandemic itself, there was all the uncertainty and the lack of agency that people felt about what was going to happen in schools. Are we going to be in person? Are we going to be on Zoom? What is that going to be like? Do communities have a voice in what's going to happen and how it's going to unfold? And do educators have a voice in that? Do students have a voice in that? I think we've only begun to understand the consequences of what it was like to go through that experience and to have, I think, many people, their sense of agency and power taken away in terms of how institutions were going to respond to this collective experience. And we're seeing that in our schools in Massachusetts. Meanwhile, the focus of the system was learning loss, and let's get those test scores up. And you may or may not know that we just voted. One of the few bright spots, last week was that we voted to remove MCAS as a high stakes graduation requirement in Massachusetts. Amazing. But the response of the system was to double down on those things, and it's just gotten everybody stressed out. So I know that's probably not exactly what your question was asking, but it's just a phenomenon that in our work we see going on in schools across our state right now, and it just felt important to acknowledge.
And we similarly see more and more youth coming through the court with wayward petitions being filed because families just don't have access to the care and services that they need. There's not enough services out there to meet the mental health needs of youth and youth are becoming, they're coming into contact with the system as a result of mental health difficulties rather than as a result of any like formal need, I guess. I don't know what I'm saying. But essentially, mental health is a driving factor for youth coming into contact with the criminal legal system. And we just really need more supports, more services, easier access, and less barriers to care for families.
Absolutely. How are we doing on time? Do a time check-in. Do we want to open up for questions? Yeah. Okay, so we'll open up to the audience if anybody has any questions for us. Now's your chance. Hello.
I'm a doctor in an emergency setting, and I get to experience and see trauma every single day and the various responses to trauma. But also, I'm amazed at the amount of resiliency, and I work primarily with youth, that is, and the variability and resiliency. And I'm wondering if in all of your practices, Michael, thinking about you in particular, how do we build resiliency? Are there specific sort of lawyering best practices for that? Of how do we help build resiliency within clients, within youth?
It's a really great question. I think we heard some really compelling examples from the first panel about ways to do that within the lawyer-client relationship. I guess maybe a couple of things that I might add to that earlier discussion is, one of the things I really focus on is one of the things that's a little bit unique maybe about the lawyer-client relationship that I've come to really embrace is that as a lawyer, I am my client's agent. So a lot of our clients engage in lots of professional relationships, but it's not always necessarily the case maybe that like what the role of the professional is really to enact the decisions that the client makes. And so I found that to be just a facet of the lawyering relationship that I really embrace. And it puts me in a position of being able to help my clients see themselves as decision makers and to help them practice the skill of making good decisions. And then them seeing me go and carrying out or attempting to carry out and doing the best I can to carry out their wishes. And I think that there's some resilience that can come from that, from starting to see yourself as agentic, from starting to see yourself as a person who can make decisions for yourself and advocate for yourself. And the second thing I'll say is that, I've spent the better part of my career, having that kind of relationship with my clients, but then being the one to go into the IEP meeting and speak for them. Trying to say what they've told me to say and advocate for what they've told me to advocate for, being the voice. And sometimes that's what people want and expect. But what I've tried to start to learn how to do in my lawyering is try to push that envelope a little bit and say, well, you've just told me what you want. I could go in and say it for you, or we could work together on how you might be able to say it. And can I support you to have a voice for yourself? And that looks different for different kids and in different circumstances, and it's certainly not a one-size-fits-all thing. And for some kids literally can't speak, and so it means something different there. But I've tried to focus more in an intentional way, to use the word that Will used before, to be intentional about ways that I can help put the young person in a position to speak for themselves and speak their truth and support them as best I can to do that. And then jump in when they need me to and, make the argument or what have you. And schools are different than other settings, so that may not be as appropriate in a court or something. But at least in the context of schools, I've tried to build resilience that way.
Could I add to that as well? I think of resilience in children as, a difficult concept, right? And I guess I envision that resilience is sort of like armor for them. And each one of us have the ability to add like a different shield to a different part of them. And, so when they come and they meet a compassionate doctor and advocates and then an attorney and a police officer, it's like adding a shield on every single part of their body to go through the process. And because resilience is a hard concept to understand, and it's a hard thing to find hope for in a child who's experienced trauma. Like how are we going to help put this child back together? How are we going to get them to get through this process? And I think that that's done in each compassionate interaction that we have with children. And that's just the visual for me as I think of a child going through, a disclosure of child sexual abuse and the subsequent medical and investigative process. I think of each person who has the ability to add an extra little piece of their armor. And that makes me hopeful because I think we can all do that. We can all be compassionate. We can all tell them that we believe them. We can all tell them that we're there and we're in their corner. And I think that that's a way that we can build resilience.
That's amazing. Thank you.
This is a slight digression perhaps, but I'm wondering about your view of the policies that we could change to lessen the trauma on children, particularly the mandatory reporting system, and whether, I assume most of the cases that get to you in family court are cases that have been substantiated where something's really going on, but there's so many where they're closed before anything happens, and yet the caseworker's been in a household, perhaps touching a child. So I'm just curious whether you think we should get rid of that and about the harm that causes.
I don't personally have a formal opinion on that at the moment, but I'm wondering if anyone else does. I have some thoughts, but it's not related to policy exactly.
The piece I would just say is, hopefully it's kind of answering it, is just to understand that kids are kids. And when we focus on criminalizing kids and adolescent behavior, then that becomes a problem. I hate to sound like a company man because I'm far from that, but Rhode Island and a family court does a really good job of keeping kids who come to the system out the system. And so now, could they do better? Of course, we can always do a lot better, but we have to balance safety and doing the right thing. But if that stays at the forefront, if I could give a policy recommendation, and I will, because I always have something, a recommendation to give, it would be to make everybody focus more on understanding adolescent behavior and adolescent brain development, from the law enforcement, the courts, and the legislature as well. Because if we understand that, then it won't bother us as much. It shouldn't be.
And I was just going to say harnessing like community strengths and building more pro-social engagement and activities within the community context. That's definitely going to provide some safeguards around a youth becoming legally involved. Once their petition is filed with the court, there's not much we can do other than divert it. But if the community had more action to supervise youth, engage them in pro-social activity, and connect them with, activities that would enhance their resiliency or find a passion for them, that would be helpful. So we always say, like, the community is a place that could also intervene to keep youth out of the system.
And my question to you is, actually specifically Meagan and Miyah, I know the scenarios that you have discussed of bringing a child to the courtroom and helping them navigate what to expect. I took those scenarios under the presumption that there was not a parent or guardian figure. How do you, when there is a parental or guardian figure in the picture, how do you balance, obviously, your advocacy for your child, which is your main focus? I imagine parents and their own trauma inflicting or impacting their own child. How do you balance that in children?
I know that it was directed at me, but you work more in the actual courtroom, so do you want to speak to that first?
So I was going to say, I primarily work on the juvenile legal side, and oftentimes we'll see that when wayward petitions are filed, the parents lose a lot of agency. They are no longer the person that, the attorney is representing. They're representing the youth at that point, and parents often get kind of siloed and cut out of the court process and the legal process. And so my recommendation would just be, in that context, we do a lot at the diversion level of informing and educating parents of, if this does go formal, you are no longer in control. The court is now in control, and you will not be the one represented. So I think having very frank conversations when it comes to waiver petitions being filed, and letting families know the consequences and how the dynamics change for the parent. And that's just on the juvenile legal side. The child welfare side, I don't spend too much time on, so I might not be able to speak to that.
And I'm working with children in the medical setting who, most will go through the legal setting as a victim. And we work with parents closely because the parent knows their child best. But what I think we forget about is a parent knows how to parent their child, but they haven't parented their child as a victim. And their world has been rocked and their life is potentially flipped upside down. And for so many children, the alleged perpetrator or the suspect is a loved one. And so not only is that non-offending parent trying to figure out how they're going to put food on the child's table because this may have been the financial supporter, but it was also their partner. It was this child's, caregiver. And so they're also processing an acute traumatic experience. And so I try to be mindful of not stepping in or over the parent's role, but really demonstrating to the parent all of the resources that they have already, hopefully, and that they can tap into. So by, even in an exam room, by demonstrating how I'm explaining the exam to a child, which, I know I'm talking about the medical setting, but you can really envision what this would look like for you all as attorneys. I'm demonstrating to the parent, and I'm not necessarily teaching something that they don't know, but they have yet to have to do. And so their role is just as important. I'm just helping to lay the groundwork for them. I think is that what you were asking, is how do you incorporate them into it? Okay, yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. I think that brings us to the end of our panel.